Good evening and welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the school. Today is the 27th of January. It's International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and a day on which here at the Blavatnik School of Government, we host the Alfred Landecker Memorial Lecture. We're delighted to do this lecture in partnership and with the Alfred Landecker Foundation, with whom we have a program here at the school, which aims to prepare public leaders to avoid the horrors of the Holocaust and of the genocides which have come since then. It's a great honor to be hosting this lecture for the third time, and I'm now going to pass you to the founding Alfred Landecker Chair, Professor Joe Wolfe, to chair tonight's event. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nairi. Well, it really is such a pleasure to be hosting this event this evening, the third Alfred Landecker Memorial Lecture. And the title, as you know, Germany, the Holocaust and the Post-Colonial Challenge. Our main speaker tonight is Professor Norbert Frei. I will introduce him in more detail in a moment. After the lecture, we will have three amazing panelists, Nick Stargatt, Mary Fulbrook, and Maya Tudor. I will also introduce the panelists a little later on. They'll make a response. Professor Frye will make a brief reply, and then we will have some minutes left in the hour for contributions from the audience, if people would like to raise a comment or, even better, ask a question. So let me introduce Professor Frye. He is a chair of modern and contemporary history at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena and heads the Jena Center for 20th Century History. He has been a full member of the Saxon Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Leipzig since 2011. His numerous publications primarily address the history and aftermath of the Third Reich, memory of the Holocaust, and the history of human rights, as well as media history of the 20th century. At the request of the Office of the Federal President of Germany, he is currently researching how the federal presidents have dealt with the country's National Socialist past, and he is the chair of the academic committee of the Alfred Landecker Foundation. Norbert very kindly pre-recorded his lecture to make sure everything would run very smoothly for us. So I'm now going to hand over so that we can play his lecture.
Dear Professor Woods, Professor Wolfe, representatives of the Alfred Landecker Foundation, members of the Reimann family, dear audience, it is an honor for me to deliver the Alfred Landecker Memorial Lecture marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It just so happens that two important historical anniversaries overlap this year. Both are determined by societal reflection and political decision. One is today, the 27th of January, when in 1945 the advancing Red Army entered the gates of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was not the first German death camp to be liberated, but it was the largest, and since 1996 its liberation officially marks Germany's Day of Remembrance of the Victims of National Socialism. And in 2005, the United Nations declared this day to be an International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of the Holocaust. The other important anniversary we mark this month is that of the Wannsee Conference. It is now 80 years since that infamous meeting took place on January 20th in a villa on the Wannsee Lake in Berlin. Top SS leaders and Nazi bureaucrats deliberated about the so-called final solution of the Jewish question, which was already underway in the occupied parts of Soviet Union and in Poland. but there was still some need to coordinate further steps, particularly regarding the German Jews. With respect to them, the Wannsee Conference stood for a change of policy, from expulsion to deportation and ghettoization and finally annihilation. Adolf Eichmann's minutes of the meeting, rediscovered only in 1946-47, are the monstrous document of a genocide in the making, a genocide which few people immediately grasped and which we call, if only since the late 1970s, the Holocaust. Maybe you can already see where I'm going here. I would like to argue that historical events, but certainly historical commemorations, are not simply there. In that sense, nothing is fixed forever and everything is subject to interpretation in a rather dynamic process. In other words, society's readiness to commemorate comes and goes and changes. The meaning of events can even be disputed. Memory can even be erased. Today, however, I'm not concerned with abstract concepts of memory and commemoration. Rather, I'm interested in concrete remembrance of the Holocaust and with how German society has dealt with its past since 1945. Over decades, while not with enthusiasm at first, Germans have been facing the history of the Holocaust. And I believe there will not be, nor should there be, an end to this discussion. A discussion which in the beginning was called the Vergangenheitsbewältigung, literally coming to terms with the past. Nowadays, the usual term is Erinnerungskultur, culture of remembrance. Whatever one calls it, this German grappling with the Nazi past has come under new criticism. Not that it had been ever uncontested, but this time the opposition not only comes from old Nazis or neo-right-wing apologists, it comes from a certain leftist strand. Interestingly, this new criticism first took shape on another symbolic date, May 23rd last year, the 72nd anniversary of the enactment of West Germany's constitution. On that day, Australian historian Dirk Moses announced on an internet portal that it was high time that Germans be done with what he called their historical catechism. He was referring to a supposed dogma of remembrance imposed on the Germans in the late 1980s. During these years, left-leaning German intellectuals allegedly had tossed out traditional ideas of national honor and replaced them with a doctrine that saw the Holocaust as a breach of civilization and a sacred trauma. According to Moses, these new intellectual high priests strived for the recognition of, quote, American, British, and Israeli elites. Allegedly, these intellectuals wanted to secure the reputation of a united Germany in the family of nations. As a result of this, Moses claims, it has become a heresy in Germany to draw comparisons between the Holocaust and other genocides, forms of racism, and colonial crimes. Now, Moses' scornful tone has earned him some critique, in particular his frequent use of religious metaphors like priestly censors, salvation history, resurrection, and a Christianized narrative of redemption to which he said an entire generation of Germans had been subjected. But quite a few historians and cultural studies scholars ignored his language and praised his argument. As a professor of global history and human rights history at Chapel Hill, Moses has been recognized as an activist with a post-colonial agenda. I would like to rebut Moses' claims that so-called German elites instrumentalized the Holocaust in order to hide other historical crimes. His account of how the supposed catechism arose is full of shortcuts and distortions. So allow me to sketch the long history of how Germany has dealt with its Nazi past. The journey began in the final weeks of the war, when Allied troops confronted Germans with the criminal history of the concentration camps in their own backyards, and it has continued ever since. We knew about these things. This was the key sentence in a speech delivered in November 1952 by German Federal President Theodor Heuss. Heuss was trying, once again, to counter the tendency in post-Nazi German society to ignore or forget. He was speaking at the dedication of the memorial in Bergen-Belsen, which had been established not on the initiative of the Germans, but at the behest of an international commission which included survivors and had been organized by the British Land Commissioner. Like many Germans, Heuss argued, he had first heard the name Belsen in the spring of 1945 on the BBC. But even if he hadn't known that name before, he knew as a German he must be able to throw off the chains of Nazi ideology and, I quote literally, recognize the full atrocity of the crimes committed here by Germans. Nobody, but nobody can take away the resulting shame, he said. Notably, there was a speaker who preceded Heuss, Nachum Goldmann, representing the World Jewish Congress. Goldmann was probably the first in post-war Germany to focus on the central role of Eastern European killing sites. Heuss picked up on Goldmann, describing the situation in Bergen-Belsen just before liberation, where, quote, those Jews who were somehow still alive were meant to be starved to death or allowed to succumb to the disease. Heuss concluded that there something new had happened, which was actually quite close to Hannah Arendt's famous later words, this should not have happened. In Germany and in the entire non-Jewish world for that matter, what Winston Churchill in 1941 had called a crime without a name remained so until the early 1960s. It was only then that the term Auschwitz was introduced as a metaphor for genocide, replacing the terms of the perpetrators like final solution. In other words, Heuss' confession in Bergen-Belsen stood in direct contrast to the popular mood in Germany. In the early 1950s, most Germans wanted to see themselves as victims, whether of Hitler, of the Allied bombings, of flight and expulsion, of denazification, or of an alleged victor's justice. If there was a phase for which the catechism argument seems halfway plausible, it was those years in which critical reflection of the past came from above and the unwillingness to do so came from below. This changed toward the end of the 1950s. 15 years after the end of the Third Reich, there was a growing movement toward research and education about its crimes. In universities and in public discourse, this project of enlightenment directly challenged many of the apologetic excuses printed in popular memoirs by Wehrmacht generals and Hitler loyalists. The critical voice of intellectuals like Adorno, writers like Grass or Böll, and young historians from the generation of the so-called Flakhelfer, the former anti-warcraft workers born around 1930, grew louder. The hushing up of personal history was challenged at the very latest with the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial starting in 1963. The social philosopher Hermann Lübbe, born in 1926, described this silence and also justified it 2 decades later as essential to the functioning of West German post-war society. Since the mid-1960s, when the generation born around 1945, the later so-called 68ers, followed the Flakhelfers onto the public stage, one could no longer refer to a top-down control over the confrontation with history. Particularly with the protest movement, there was a growing conviction that the unresolved past was poisoning West German democracy. In general, however, history was not such a big thing in the 1970s. But the topic came back with full force in January 1979 with the West German broadcast of the American TV series Holocaust. The subtitle of the book produced in its wake was A Nation in Shame, and ashamed it was. This broadcast triggered a research boom in regional and everyday Nazi history, and even more important, a grassroots history workshop movement. This was largely driven by the 68ers, whose attention to forgotten victims and authentic sides of Nazi crimes laid the foundation for today's memory landscape in Germany. In the 1980s and 90s, Germany's confrontation with Nazi history was led from below. When the state stepped in, for example on major anniversaries, there would usually be conflicts and public opposition, particularly because of the conservative remembrance politics of Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who, by the way, held a PhD in history. By contrast, Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker earned highest recognition at home and abroad for his speech on May 8, 1985, marking the 50th anniversary of the end of war in Europe. No one seemed to care that Weizsäcker at some important points just followed his predecessors. For example, when he adopted Heuy's knowing about the persecution of the Jews, or Walter Scheel's use of the term liberation. The years after 1989, when Germans were supposedly prescribed a national catechism, were in fact a period marked by the liveliest public debates. We need only to consider the decade's most important events and controversies in the politics of remembrance. From Parliament President Philipp Jenninger's historically correct but rhetorically unfortunate speech in 1988, marking the 50th anniversary of the Kristallnacht pogrom, the release in Germany of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List in 1994, from the exhibition about the Wehrmacht crimes and the debate about Daniel Goldhagen's book on Hitler's willing executioners, up to and including Martin Walser's 1998 Frankfurt Book Fair Peace Prize speech, in which he referred to Auschwitz as a moral cudgel held against Germany. And of course was confronted with massive critique. None of these confrontations with history were imposed by an ominous elite. Rather, they expressed Germany's search for self in an age of still growing Holocaust awareness. At just about the same time, the German government introduced a federal memorials concept. Over the past 2 decades, this framework has provided support not only for major concentration camp memorials and sites related to the East German communist dictatorship, but also for smaller sites of Nazi history that had been identified and preserved by activists. These institutions have come to rely on state financial support for their educational offerings. But that does not mean that they are beholden to government directives. Nor does it mean that they can succeed without ongoing support from civil society. Responding to Dirk Moses, German historian Jakob Eder, born in 1997, described how profoundly his generation was influenced by the memory debates of the 1990s. And he called it almost cynical to suggest that he had been urged to follow a catechism at that time. As Eder put it, and I quote him, "The wider German public was just beginning to break free of that narrow focus on the German context and to look at the impacts of Nazi persecution and extermination policies in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union." The same was true, as Eder correctly notes, for archive-based regional Holocaust research, which really took off in Germany and around the world only in the 1990s. According to the postcolonial critique, all of this should now come to an end. The attention given to the Holocaust in the past 3 decades in Germany and the Western world should make room for other neglected genocides. Now, it is true that the Germans, like most Europeans, are only becoming interested in the crimes of their colonial past. It is also true that the recurrent debates about looted art of the colonial era are gaining much public resonance. The debates about the Benin bronzes or about the furnishings of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin point to a new direction. The same goes for Germany's recent recognition of its genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in what today is part of Namibia. While earlier German governments had refused to use the term genocide, this changed last summer. So there is definitely change afoot in the culture and policy of remembrance. This is another reason why Moses' charges ring so false. If one takes a closer look at his objections against the alleged German catechism, it becomes clear that he is not interested at all, for example, in improving educational work in a post-migrant society. No, his goal is rather to establish new rules. He wants to place the Holocaust in its historical context, that is, to relativize in its relation to other genocide. At the same time, he wants anti-Semitism to be understood as a mere subcategory of an omnipresent racism. And under no circumstances can he accept that anti-Semitism might disguise itself as anti-Zionism. Here one needs to know that the argument that some anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic was one of the reasons for the resolution with which the German parliament opposed the BDS movement and its boycott of Israel in May 2019. As already indicated, Moses' mix of crude arguments and activism is applauded by activists of left-wing identity politics, but also by the identitarian New Right. His piece has barely gone online when Martin Sellner posted a triumphant headline on the homepage of the right-wing magazine Secession. Quote, "Postcolonial attacks on the myth of Auschwitz." Borrowing from Sigmund Freud, Sellner diagnosed a narcissism of small differences with what he called the ethno-masochistic camp. According to Sellner, the infighting between proponents of the German religion of guilt creates a nice foundation for the right-wing task of, quote, overcoming the cult of guilt. While Moses doesn't seem to be bothered much by this applause from the right, some of his supporters felt annoyed. They complain that certain critics of the catechism argument reflecting a white majority society risk putting Moses into the neighborhood of the intellectual discourse of Germany's extreme right, as if it's the fault of the critics and not Moses' own doing. Unlike Germany, where the buzz about Moses' catechism spilled quickly over into mainstream media, in the US, the discussion played out only on specialist portals and on Twitter. On the anti-New Right website, The New Fascism Syllabus, the American historian Helmut Walser-Smith identified parallels between the cult of guilt theory of the radical right and Moses' claim of a national redemptive philo-Semitism. Let me quote Walser-Smith here: "To narrate Germany's turn to its past as an expectation of national salvation dramatically foreshortens two aspects of that turn: how it happened on the ground and the complexity of the historical landscape. It also makes national memory into a kind of religious war, which it is not." According to Moses, it is now getting harder for what he calls the religious guardians of German remembrance politics to, quote, discipline the population given the passage of time and demographic changes. To me, this supports not only the most perfidious claims of the new right, it also is astonishingly malicious toward all those who have been striving for decades for historical critical enlightenment, be it on former concentration camp sites, in schools, or in universities. And by the way, it is quite far from the academic reality. For example, in 2018, a study showed that there is definitely not an excess of Holocaust-related courses at German universities. One does not have to study history to understand that every age has its blind spots. Anyone who understands this and is not caught up in prejudices can have no problem giving a greater place to the memory of colonial crimes in German, European, or Western memory. Rather, this can also be an enrichment, as Jürgen Habermas recently stated, namely by changing and expanding our political culture in such a way that those who have newly arrived as immigrants during the last decade also can recognize themselves as citizens, accepted with their heritage, be it a history of colonial suffering or not. However, there is a precondition, and I quote now Habermas literally. With the acquisition of citizenship, the new citizen accepts the political culture and the historical heritage of our country. Of this, the outlawing of anti-Semitism is an indispensable core. I would add that it is precisely for this reason that the confrontation with the Holocaust, as well as the critical examination of its aftermath, cannot be finalized. It must remain, in principle, an open field of research, of education, and of public debate. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much for your profound and enlightening lecture, Professor Frye. And if I may say, it was beautifully delivered. A real pleasure to listen to. So we now have three commentators, of whom the first is Professor Nicholas Stargadt, who is Professor of Modern European History at Magdalen College, Oxford. For the last 20 years, Professor Stargatt has tried to understand the experience of those who lived in Germany and under German occupation during the Second World War. And this has resulted in two major books: Witnesses of War, Children's Lives Under the Nazis, 2005, was the first work to show how children experienced the Second World War under the Nazis, exploring the widely divergent experiences of German and Jewish, Polish and Czech, Sinti and disabled children, showing that children became increasingly important social actors in their own right. The German War, A Nation Under Arms, 1939 to 1945, published in 2015, answers the key question without which we cannot understand how Germans were able to continue the war till the bitter end. What did they think they were fighting for? How did their views and expectations change? When did Germans first realize that they were fighting a genocidal war, and how did they deal with this knowledge? So, Nick, over to you for your comments.
Thank you so much, and Norbert, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'd like to start by endorsing what I think has been the main point you're trying to make here, which is that Holocaust remembrance in post-war Germany, especially starting with West Germany and United Germany, was not something which was simply part of an official agenda or a Foucauldian discourse of social control in the way that it appears in Dirk's latest book. It was a hard-won battle between activists, people asking awkward questions in their medical schools about the provenance of human remains which are being used to demonstrate and turned out to come from psychiatric patients murdered in the so-called euthanasia action or in concentration camps. And these were not easy discussions in the 1980s or the 1990s. And they also dramatically changed how historians understood what they were talking about. And they widened the story from being one about the murder of the Jews to being one about the creation of a racial state, which was intent on reordering not just the relations between Germans and Jews within the Reich, but a wholesale colonization project and racial cleansing across Eastern Europe and, in the end, all of Europe. And that, I think, brings us to a fundamental thing about the Holocaust, which we simply can't get around, that there's a certain point, and that's, I think, the point of bringing up Wannsee at the beginning of your talk, is that there's a point where the indiscriminate murder or the unlimited murder and killing of civilians turns into the limitless and universal project of killing all Jews. And that happens somewhere after the Wannsee Conference. There's a point, as Saul Friedlander has described, in which rounding up the 6 Jews who lived on the Greek island of Kos and deporting them to the death camps has nothing to do with creating living space or colonizing Eastern Europe. It only has to do with the universal project, which is being centrally directed. And that lifts the Holocaust onto a plane of centrally organized, state-sponsored genocide, which fortunately no other genocide has yet reached. The timelines matter. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing, and it's what peels it back and allows us to reconnect with other genocides and to think more about the challenges of thinking about this in a post-colonial context, which is, there is a point before 1942 in which the Holocaust is already underway in many ways. We have the mass murder, the mass shootings in the rear of the Wehrmacht as it campaigns in the Soviet Union, which is comparable to the Armenian genocide, and Hitler certainly makes the comparison. We have the use of mass concentration camps. The Nazis are well aware and like using the model of what the British did in the Boer War. And of course, at the very beginning of the war, we have the mass deportation of Poles into what was seen as a rump territory, or Hitler liked talking about as Indian stations, pulling on the analogies of North America. Strikingly, none of the Nazi leaders talked about what Germans had done in Southwest Africa to the Herero and the Nama. It's as if that isn't part of their metaphorical repertoire. It doesn't mean it's not important. And we owe it to historians like Jürgen Zimmerer and Isabel Howell to have drawn it to our attention 20, 25 years ago in their pioneering works on this subject. But they couldn't make a direct connection of either personnel or of policies between colonial massacres and indiscriminate, limitless killing of civilians and what unfolds in 1939 to 1945. What's more disturbing, and this is where it's really the main point I want to make, because I think any consideration of the Holocaust ought to ask us disturbing questions. We are long beyond the point where we talk about guilty Germans and righteous allies. The most disturbing connections between the murder of civilians pre-Second World War in colonial contexts and in the Second World War as a strategy of warfare are actually on the Allied side. And here I'm thinking about the use of air power as a tool of reprisal and pacification. And just to take one obvious example, one of its pioneers in Iraq and India firebombing villages is, of course, Arthur Harris, the pioneer and architect of Bomber Command as a weapon of strategic warfare against German cities. Harris and area bombing is, of course, a staple of the extreme right in Germany. And every anniversary of the bombing of Dresden, the extreme right marches with its banner saying bombing-Holocaust, which is, of course, an idea of a mutual war of extermination between Jews and Germans, which Goebbels pioneered at the time. It is a slogan that actually has very strong Nazi propaganda connotations. It doesn't mean that we should stop thinking about it. I think we should ask ourselves all the most difficult questions about the manifold interplay between ideas of unlimited warfare or morally unconstrained warfare. I mean, at the same time as Harris is starting to bomb Iraqi villages in 1924, discussions on the Geneva Conventions are underway about limiting warfare. And one of the exceptions the British insist on is that they should not apply to imperial territories. And so I think the ironies in these stories are about an interplay, because of course the ideas that he was using were not ones that came out of colonial warfare, they came out of European warfare. They were Duhay's ideas post First World War of how one should wage war in Europe. So it was as if Harris, in fact, was rehearsing things in places where he could do so, just as volunteer flyers from America were rehearsing air warfare against Moroccan villages at the same time. So I just want to throw out there that the post-colonial challenges to unthink how we see the Second World War and this period of European history do not just apply to German historians or to Germany, they apply to all of us. And I think in the last 2 or 3 years, we've all become a lot more aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. So much to think about there, and we'll certainly come back to it. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Professor Mary Fulbrook, Fellow of the British Academy. Mary is Professor of German History at UCL and former Executive Dean of the Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences. A graduate of Cambridge and Harvard, she's the author or editor of more than 25 books. Her most recent book, Reckonings, Legacies of Nazi Persecution and the Quest for Justice, won the 2019 Wolfson Prize. Previous books include the Frankel Prize winning A Small Town Near Auschwitz, Ordinary Nazis and the Holocaust in 2012, and Dissonant Lives, Generations and Violence Through the German Dictatorships, 2011, as well as studies of the GDR and East German society, questions of national identity after the Holocaust, and theoretical issues in history. She's currently writing a book on bystander society in Nazi Germany, conformity, complicity, and the Holocaust, and directing an AHRC-sponsored collaborative research project on compromised identities, reflection and perpetration and identity under Nazism. So Mary, over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Norbert, for a fascinating and really interesting lecture that managed to cover an awful lot in a very short space of time, brilliantly done. I found myself in a bit of difficulty commenting on this lecture because there's an element of shadow boxing involved. What we're dealing with here are really two separate strands of argument. One has to do with the claims that Norbert really fronts up about how the Nazi past has been addressed in Germany in the decades since the defeat of the Third Reich. But the other, which forms the larger background to the lecture, are the provocative claims made by Dirk Moses and others, the German Catechism, which Norbert repeatedly referred to, which highlight the supposed marginalization of colonialism or other genocides by a particularly supposedly dominant German approach to the Holocaust, putting it front and center. And so this kind of shadow boxing, I think, requires two areas of comment in responding to the lecture. There are two questions. Was Dirk Moses wrong on what we draw out of Dirk Moses? Do we draw something different out of it from the critique that's been developed in the lecture? And whether or not we agree with the critique of Moses, is Norbert right in his alternative account of German Vergangenheitsbewältigung? So I'll just take those 2 points separately and rather too quickly, probably, for the enormity and complexity of the points that are raised in both those areas. Dirk Moses was extremely provocative, I would say downright rude, and I think people could sense the slight frustration and irritation in the tone of Norbert's lecture, where people have been working so hard to open up the Nazi past and debate it in a way that is not done justice by Dirk Moses's account. This is not a civilized debate in the tone in which he presented it, although some of the responses to it have made some good, interesting, fruitful and productive remarks. But I just want to pull out some of the things that I think we might want to discuss with respect to Moses. First of all, I think there is this really thorny issue of the uniqueness or comparability of the Holocaust, which is reappearing in a different shape and form now from the form in which it was discussed in the 1980s in the Historischer Streit. And I think we've all agreed since then that comparing and contrasting is of the essence of the historical method. All cases in history are in some sense historically unique configurations, and some conceptual frameworks are more useful than others for teasing out similarities, differences, and the relevance of different elements in particular combinations. This is a really fundamental theoretical and methodological point. It depends what concepts you use, what is useful to lump cases together, to compare them, to contrast them. And I think this is something that the Dirk Moses debate should prompt us to say more explicitly than I think it's often recognized. The second point that I think comes out of the Moses debate is that what commands the attention of either experts, historical professionals, or wider publics at different times will vary and is not dependent on particular historical interpretations. So we can't impute base motives to the unnamed so-called high priests of the German Catechism, as Moses seems to. And I don't think Moses empirically demonstrates either the motivations or the consequences in the ways that he implies. But I do think we have to keep separate the issue of what commands attention and concerns people from how we're interpreting things. It's another wider methodological point, in a sense. If we're bothered about colonialism and bothered about the colonial heritage, that's irrespective of the extent to which we look at the Holocaust in a post-colonial interpretive framework. So the third point I think that's worth raising from the Moses debate is that we still do need to understand and explain the Holocaust. And Nick has already started raising some points for discussion there. And I think that despite the emphasis on Lebensraum, the colonialism is only up to a point a useful approach. I don't think anyone has shown genuine, not even Isabel Hull in her path-breaking work that Nick mentioned, no one has actually shown a direct line between the colonialism of the imperial period and the Holocaust. Some elements are certainly similar, but again, as Saul Friedlander pointed out, the notion of redemptive anti-Semitism, attacking the Jew as a concept, is something that goes far wider than land grabbing or the logics of colonial exploitation of subjugated labor. And the fourth point, with respect to Dirk Moses and the debate coming from it, is that it's quite clear that we should yet again reject explicitly competitions of victimhood and suffering. These, for many years, plagued debates around Holocaust victims. It's now coming up again in a different form in terms of victims of racism and anti-Semitism. And I think that's an area that really, on today of all days, when it's Holocaust Memorial Day, we have to remember that all suffering is suffering. There are different reasons for it, and we have to be a little bit more careful and sensitive and differentiated in our approach. Now, that's shadowboxing with Moses through Frye, if I can put it that way. The counter-interpretation that Norbert has presented, which, as one would expect from somebody who's been the absolute pioneer and doyen of this area, of plotting West Germany's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, it's a very subtle, it's a very clear and forceful account, and Norbert has done more than virtually anyone I can think of to expose not only the strengths but also the limitations of the ways in which Germany didn't adequately confront and deal with its Nazi past from very early on. And I think he's right in this lecture and in this context to focus on the openness of German debates in the public sphere, pointing to the ways in which key German individuals very early on acknowledged the enormity of Nazi crimes and professed a sense of shame. And he's right to trace the evolving culture of remembrance, as he calls it, the societal reflections on what he quotes, something that should not have happened. And it's for this remembrance culture that the Federal Republic of Germany has gained widespread recognition. He's also right to point to the complexities of the current situation, not only in Germany, but across a far wider arena with regard to identity politics and the new right. And these are things I think we have to take up. But I do think there's an enormously missing element, which will not be news to Norbert Frye, because he knows it, as I say, almost better than anyone. But I do think we have to remember there's a difference between a culture of remembrance, a nation of shame, and actually a differentiated acknowledgement of guilt and dealing with questions of justice. And a more comprehensive, and my personal view is that Germany's done brilliantly on the remembrance and the shame, and has done extremely badly on bringing people to justice. So a more comprehensive approach would highlight also the simultaneous grotesque inadequacies in the areas of bringing former Nazis to justice in the courts and in dealing with practical issues very belatedly of restitution and reparation and recognition of different victim groups, and dealing with the legacies of widespread complicity in everyday life and long-term benefiting from the Nazi persecution of Jews and other victims. This may not be the day to talk about that. Perhaps that's a digression from the issues raised by Moses, but I don't think it is, because I think part of the current colonialism debate does have a lot to do with reparation and restitution. So to conclude, I can't really share Norbert's, what I see as overly rosy narrative of the West German way of dealing with the past through a public culture of remembrance. I fear, and this may be glass half full, glass half empty, because I think we both agree on the actual historical development, but I fear that a public culture of remembrance serves to disguise a really inadequate practical dealing with the past. Vergangenheitsbewältigung has more to it than just remembering victims. And it's all very well to be world leader in memorialization of national shame, but it would have been better if some practical amends had been made over the decades during which some survivors could still have benefited, and prominent perpetrators, not secretaries in Stutthof and that level, could have still been held to account in court. So to conclude, I think Frye is right to pick the clear holes and identify the difficulties in Moses' approach. I don't fully share the counter-narrative he's developed. I think it's half the counter-narrative we need. And I think that he's right to point out the thorny questions that remain, not least to do with contemporary questions about racism and anti-Semitism, which are not so easily resolved, and left and right-wing identity politics, which are far less easily resolved than historical accounts of remembrance politics and debates that we can conduct in a more civilized fashion than I think some of the recent contributions have been. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Wonderful comments. Can I just remind certainly participants on Zoom that if you want to raise a question, can you please type your question into the Q&A panel that you will see comes up from the link at the bottom of your screen. We're hoping to have a few minutes. We may need to overrun maybe by 5 or 10 minutes to have a Q&A, but we'd like to do that if there are questions. But before we get there, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Maya Tudor, who is Associate Professor of Government and Public Policy at the school, the Blavatnik School of Government. Her research investigates the origins of stable, democratic, and effective states across the developing world, with a particular emphasis upon South Asia. She was educated at Stanford University and Princeton, and has held fellowships at Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. She's currently working on 2 book manuscripts, a comparative study of nationalisms and democracy in Asia, and a critical review of nationalism. Her last book, The Promise of Power, Cambridge University Press 2013, was based upon her 2010 dissertation, which won the American Political Science Association Gabriel Arman Prize for the best dissertation in comparative politics. The book investigates the origins of India and Pakistan's puzzling regime divergence in the aftermath of colonial independence. And so you'll see we have a scholar coming from a rather different direction to the previous commentators, and we're much looking forward to it. So over to you, Maya.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you also to Professor Frye for this really important provocation at an important moment of commemoration. So as you've heard, I'm a comparativist, and I'm also an American and a German citizen. So I'm a professional as well as a personal comparativist in this topic. And so we're living at a time where activists everywhere are rightly asking their states, their myths, their monuments, their museums to newly acknowledge the historically marginalized and the victimized. And it's for this reason that the question of how Germany commemorates the Holocaust while also recognizing historical wrongs, especially colonial wrongs, is relevant in thinking through how diversifying countries around the world commemorate their own checkered pasts. So the post-colonial challenge to Germany's commemoration, as Professor Frye has described it, is that it focuses too much on the Holocaust at the expense of recognizing other historical and specifically colonial wrongs. And this claim, as I see it, is made up of 2 parts. The first claim, which Professor Frye says is not correct, is that there is an excessive focus on the Holocaust in Germany's public imagination. And the second claim, which I believe Professor Frye says is correct, is that more can be done to acknowledge Germany's colonial past. At the heart of this debate lies two questions that I want to foreground, and that is whether the comparison of political pasts is inherently relativizing or zero sum. And those are questions that Mary has already alluded to, and you'll see some common themes here. These are important questions that are relevant for a range of contemporary debates about historical commemoration. Each country's history is unique and incomparable in all of its textural richness. And some would say that that makes comparisons definitionally relativizing and minimizing. Being the comparativist that I am, it won't surprise you to hear that I believe instead that comparison is an indispensable component of our search for broader truth. In a class that I taught last week here at the Blavatnik School with Oxford graduate students, I stated that different patterns of state capacity across the developing world, that different patterns of state capacity are partly explained through the lens of comparative colonial legacies. Korea simply inherited a more robust state apparatus from its Japanese colonizers than the Nigerians inherited from their British colonizers. And this difference, moreover, meaningfully contributed to Korea's post-war growth miracle. Now, some students objected to the very nature of the comparison because it seemed to shed Korean suffering under Japanese colonialism in a kind of positive light. And such a response reflects, I believe, what is a pretty recurrent psychological tendency, and one that we see reflected in public debates today, to think in dichotomous terms and to paint historical experiences with simple and broad moral brushes. And I give this example of a mixed historical legacy, and one that can be seen as mixed really only through a comparative lens, as a way to suggest that not only is comparison without minimization possible, but that it's absolutely necessary. In the process, though, it reveals uncomfortable ambiguities, especially in an age of ideological certainty and of outrage. Professor Frei and the postcolonial critics of Germany's past both share the view that Germany needs to do more to recognize the horrors of its colonial past. So where and how exactly do they disagree? It seems to me that we need greater clarity on when, if ever, the additional commemoration of past horrors, such as the German genocide in Namibia that Professor Frye mentions, undermines or relativizes or is hidden by Germany's Holocaust commemoration. I also want to raise a second closing question about whether we can say anything useful about the circumstances under which countries and people feel comfortable acknowledging their own dark chapters of history. Implicit in the post-colonial critique of German history is that commemoration is somehow zero-sum. The Holocaust commemoration somehow stands in the way of making room for commemorating additional historical wrongs. But it seems to me, and this is simply conjecture rather than something I've researched, that the precise opposite is more likely to be true. It seems to me that countries like people who possess a cast of mind that allows them to wholly acknowledge, if that's possible, past wrongs, are more likely to be able to acknowledge the need for more historical commemoration. So I'll close by saying that these two questions, one, is historical commemoration of past wrongs inherently minimizing? And two, what do we know about the circumstance under which governments and nations are more likely to be able to confront their own dark pasts? That those two are important questions not just for Germany, but for the many countries that are currently grappling and re-examining their own historical commemorations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maya. And thank you to all of the panelists for your contributions, raising issues that would keep us here for hours, if not days, if we were going to give full consideration. Unfortunately, what we have is minutes rather than hours. And so what I'm going to do now, we have certainly one question, possibly two questions in the Q&A. So I will read out the first question from Fergal McCarthy and ask Professor Frye to answer that. And I will also, before we close, to see if Professor Frye wants to make any comments in response to the panelists a little later on. But for now, let me read out the first question from Fergal McCarthy. Given the distinct increase in the use of official or state apologies in international and national affairs since the end of the Cold War, scholars have come to refer to this period, 1990s to today, as the Age of Apology. Willy Brandt's Kniefall moment in Warsaw in 1970 is often held up as one of the most iconic examples of a political official performing a very public act of remorse. Do you think there is still any need or desire today for an official apology by the German authorities to those affected by the events of World War II? So Norbert, over to you. Are you there, Norbert? Have you disappeared? You're on mute, I think.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, indeed. There is this age of apology, which I think is still ongoing. I mean, this is a process with which, yes, Willy Brandt's Kniefall in Warsaw was an important moment, starting this kind of symbolic policy. This is certainly something which had a high time probably in the 1990s. I think we are, to some extent, we are over this period of public excuses. And I would actually combine it with what Mary remarked in her wonderful comment about the difference between the remembrance culture, which is actually not my word. I use this word Erinnerungskultur, but I don't like it particularly. And the real politics of compensation, of reparation, and so forth. There is a difference, and I would agree that part of this apology, this public apology, is also in order to not address more difficult questions of reparation, etc. Now, we see at the moment in politics these questions of reparations coming back in quite a few cases, like the conservative Polish government tends to make this point towards Germany now. I'm asking myself quite some time whether we need to come to another form of discussing about the past without remaining in this simple culture of remembrance, yes. And we have to look definitely into questions of reparations for colonial crimes, which in fact is the case in Germany at the moment. There are conversations with Namibia about this, and there are groups which are pro and others which are con. What Namibia and the German government were talking about in the last couple of years. But it's not an easy thing. And it's always the question where to begin, where to end, where to start new ways of thinking about these questions. And in that respect, I fully agree with Mary that my lecture here was basically a lecture on this intellectual process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, of coming to terms, and not that much a lecture on the question of how the Germans dealt with their perpetrators after the main trials, for instance, from Nuremberg onwards. There were German trials, but certainly they were trials within a society of perpetrators, and the limitations of what you can achieve in a society where the perpetrators and the bystanders and all these different kinds of people who were involved in the crimes of a period, how you can work through this is really something which is interesting and important, not only for the German case, but as Nick, to some extent, also alluded to, virtually for all societies who were involved in, let's say, the Second World War, but also in colonial experiences. So this is just an idea where one could go into a further discussion, but you had such an array of wonderful comments and remarks that I'm absolutely not able to respond to all of them in the remaining 1 or 2 minutes. I don't know whether we have even 1 or 2 minutes, but I take a lot from this back home and think about it again.
So this is such an important issue, I think, that what I would love is to take 30 seconds for each of the 3 panelists to respond to what Norbert has just said, and then Norbert give you the last 15 seconds before we close. So Mary, this is optional, but if you'd like to just chip in for 30 seconds, the time is yours now.
Okay, I just want to thank Norbert again for fantastic lecture and commentary now. And the practical compensation dealing with the past, I think, is really vital to take much further. But I did actually wonder if Norbert still has 10 seconds at the end, whether he could respond to the knotty issues around racism, anti-Semitism, identity politics that he also raised in the lecture, and that I think the wider debate has been circling around as well. It's dealing with the present as well as dealing with the past.
Thank you, Mary. Maya, to you now.
I also just want to extend my really heartfelt, I'm just honored to be included in the discussion and to have an opportunity to think through some of these issues. And I think this point that none of us really drew out as panelists, but that you mentioned, Professor Frye, in your lecture, that commemoration is ongoing. It's a permanent process of becoming, and is something that I just think is important to underscore as we think again about how to do this beyond Germany, and certainly here in the United Kingdom. These questions of how we commemorate our pasts are front and center in public discussions. And I think in some sense, there's much to be learned from Germany.
Okay, thanks so much. And Nick, you're up now.
Well, I'd like to add my thanks as well. And I suppose the only thing I'd like to say in my 5 seconds is that how one commemorates and what the same gestures of commemoration mean change dramatically where they're held and who does them. And I think it's terribly important. Teaching in a university which was center stage in one of probably Britain's most important actions in the 20th century, namely to resist fascism, that we also think about it self-critically and not triumphantly. And I think that's been the tone throughout our discussions this evening, and I'd like to thank everybody for doing that.
So I think we all want to add our thanks, but before we give the final thanks, Norbert, let's say you have 1 minute now to reply to everything that's gone before you.
Okay, I'll try 1 minute. Actually, this morning I watched the commemoration in the Federal Parliament where Inge Auerbacher was speaking. 87-year-old German Jew from a Swabian town who survived Theresienstadt, and ended up for 75 years now in New York. And her basic line was, look, I'm living here now in New York for 75 years with a Muslim neighbor on the one side and a Christian neighbor on the other side, or something like that. She identified her neighborhood in Queens. And we are living here together, and we ought to live here together. And we can do this. And this is a lesson I draw. So this was a rather simple but very impressive lecture. And well, I mean, one could imagine that something like this, the federal president is there, the chancellor is there, the Israeli president of the Knesset is there, and the German parliament president speaks. So this is a rather highly official situation. And it's a situation in which the parliamentary president has to state that, again, in Germany, 30% of the population believe that the Jews have too much power. I mean, this is the newest public opinion. So it's an ongoing process. And it's an ongoing process where we also have to include the memory and the experience of all these immigrants who came into this Germany of today in the last 70 years. And it's a completely different situation, completely different social composition, this Germany now, as opposed to the 70s or 80s, or even the 90s, when we had these enormous debates about the politics of the past. So all I'm saying here is I'm not at all discouraged to try to get on with the challenge of commemorating the history of this country, and to include other parts, but the Holocaust. But of course, this is a central crime in the midst of the 20th century. And as Nick so wonderfully argued, it's a precedentless crime, and quoting Saul Friedlander with this redemptive anti-Semitism. This makes the Holocaust something special forever, I would say. But, and Maya had this point very strongly, it can be compared, it must be compared. We can only learn if we compare, but we cannot or should not substitute one crime against humanities against the other.
Okay, thank you so much. So this is an ongoing process, an ongoing debate. So much to say. Thankfully, this lecture and panel has been recorded. It will be made publicly available. We can return to it and think through the themes again. I think it's been such a rich and stimulating occasion. So thank you so much, Norbert, for your wonderful lecture, and to all the panelists. It's time to bring the event to a close now. And so on behalf of the Blavatnik School of Government, and insofar as I can speak for them, the Alfred Landecker Foundation, thank you to all the panelists, all the audience, and we will say good night to you now. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.